Once again, Jai Bhim and Namo Buddhaya to all of you who are joining today. Today is the third session of the four sessions that Stephen Batchelor is going to lead through what he terms as the four great tasks. So today he's going to talk on the third aspect of the great task, which is equated with nirvana traditionally. He's going to talk about see reactivity stop. So I would like to request Stephen to kindly begin his third session tonight.
Thank you very much, Mangesh, and thank you all for being here. And I look forward now to two more sessions this evening, and then we have one final session next Sunday. So as Mangesh already said, this evening we're going to talk about the third task, which is seeing reactivity stop, or in my more recent version, recognizing non-reactivity. So let's just quickly go through these four tasks again. I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, but it doesn't hurt to be reminded. The first task is to embrace life, to embrace suffering, or to comprehend your life situation, to be fully present and aware for what is going on. The second task is to let reactivity be. That's what we spoke about last week. In other words, when we find ourselves in life situations, we often notice that that causes us to react in a particular way. Some of those reactions are perfectly natural, useful, valuable. Like if there's danger, we step aside, we take evasive action. Other patterns of reactivity, as we explained yesterday, are really more to do with our conditioning and habit pattern and past trauma and so forth and so on, that actually get in the way of being able to respond effectively to life. And the third task, what we're going to look at today, is to become more attuned, to become more aware of what it's like to not be reactive. And the reason for that is not to attain nirvana, although traditionally this would be called nirvana, but to discover within that non-reactive space of mind the capacity, the possibility of responding afresh to oneself, to the world, to others, in a way that's not determined by our past reactive patterns, but is free to respond with care, particularly with kindness, with wisdom to the situations of life themselves. So as you may be beginning to see what's going on in this approach, is we're describing a certain process. And it's the process that matters. I would go so far as to say that enlightenment or awakening, which is a somewhat better translation, is not a state. It's not something that we get to one day after having spent hours and hours meditating or doing good works or going on retreat or being a monk or nun. It's not as though enlightenment is a goal that one day we will arrive at and then everything will be okay, everything will be different, and we'll be a Buddha. In English, we have the advantage in the word awakening, and it's a purely linguistic advantage, that awakening can be both a noun, a gerundive noun, an awakening, but it can also be a past participle, a present participle. It can mean the process of waking up, awakening, like a flower, or maybe you have a cat and slowly you can see it wake up in the morning, it begins to move or whatever. So I like to think of awakening as a process, and a process of living fully, a process of being fully alive, and not just at some hypothetical point in the future when we have become enlightened or whatever, like the Buddha, but actually a process of being fully alive that we bring to every moment of our lives. And this, I think, is describing a certain logic. Now, I know for some of you, as soon as you hear the word logic, you switch off. This sounds very abstract. This sounds very intellectual. But logic is just a way of describing how processes unfold. If A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D, it describes a sequence that is lawful. And we might compare the logic of awakening to the patterns of the four seasons themselves. In other words, we might start with summer. Summer is the precondition that leads us to autumn. Autumn is the condition that leads us to winter. Winter is the condition that leads us to spring. And spring is the condition that leads us to summer. So what we see by comparing these four tasks to the four seasons is that this is an entirely natural process. Awakening, therefore, is something embedded in the very process of natural life itself. It's not achieved by the intervention of some divine insight or by some moment of grace or by the blessing of a guru or a god. Awakening is a process that we engage in consciously and responsibly as human beings by recognizing the conditions that inform our lives, recognizing which conditions actually are life enhancing and which conditions are basically there just to protect us against death. In other words, conditions that create habit patterns that keep us stuck and fixed. But what's also, I think, important with the analogy to the four seasons is that the seasons are repetitive. And again, we said last week that this is one of the markers of reactivity itself. It's repetitive. It keeps on going round and round, the same thoughts, the same emotions, the same impulses that we inherited from our parents. They just keep repeating. And in this sense, they don't get us anywhere. They actually just keep things in place. But the seasons are not like that. They're repetitive. In other words, spring, summer, autumn, winter, they keep coming round again and again, but they're not circular. They operate through time, and at each turn of the circle, a little more has grown on Earth. So if you think of a tree, for example, the tree in year one, also it shows all its leaves, it produces its fruits. The leaves then fall in the autumn, the tree is bare in the winter, the sprouts emerge again, the leaves emerge again in the spring. But in emerging again in the spring, the tree has also grown. It's not the same tree there the year before. It might be a few inches bigger, it might have entered into another stage of its cycle or whatever. But it's growing, it's moving, it's evolving, but it's doing so through a certain logic that keeps repeating. Now, this, I think, actually brings us to a phrase that I think we might have mentioned already, but it's a passage in one of the suttas, one of the early Buddhist discourses, where the Buddha says, the person who sees conditionality sees the Dharma. Now, conditionality, I'm translating paticca samuppada, sometimes rendered more literally as dependent origination or conditioned arising, which again is just a description of how causes give rise to effects, effects give rise to further causes, and so forth and so on. It's the description of the conditional or the contingent nature of life itself. And the Buddha points out that it's by seeing this conditionality, by seeing this process, that we see the Dharma itself. So in the same way as the seasons, we have the four tasks or the four paths. The four paths, I'll remind you, those are formation, unification, seeing, and cultivation. And what's distinctive about the tasks and the paths is that the first one leads to the second to the third to the fourth. And in other words, these paths, these tasks, are a way of embodying in one's own life the underlying principle of conditionality. Now, if we look into other Buddhist teachings, we find this same pattern being repeated in quite different schools of thought. We find, for example, the four great vows, which is primarily known in the Chinese traditions. Often, for many of us, it's known through the Zen tradition. And the four vows, as you'll see on your chart, beings are boundless. I will care for them all. Reactivity is inexhaustible. I will let go of it all. Gateways are numberless. I will enter them all. The path has no end. I will get there. There's something paradoxical in that, but the important point is that these four vows mirror very precisely the process of awakening, the logic of awakening that is instantiated in the four tasks. The four vows are just raising the tasks to a higher level of commitment, where you actually vow to lead your life in this way. You vow as a sincere commitment to embrace life, let reactivity be, see it stopping, and cultivating a path. We also mentioned in our first session the four steps of creativity, which occur on the first path of formation. They're part of the process of embracing life. They have to do with how we imagine we can realize our goals in life. And there we have aspiration, perseverance, intuition, experimentation. And if we look at this more carefully, I'm not going to do that now, but we did on the first talk a little bit. Here too, we see the same basic logic. So I see these tasks as mirroring very precisely the underlying principle of conditionality itself. Now, if we look at this process as a process that is occurring over time, and conditionality necessarily is something that operates within the temporal nature of our lives, days and months and years as they pass by, then we can also see how reactivity in many ways could be understood as the past, our culture's past, reasserting itself in the present moment. So I meet an entirely new situation in my life. I meet someone I've never met before, but in that moment of meeting, I'm triggered. And sometimes that triggering produces a reactive pattern that I've already been doing many times in the past. It might be a reactive pattern from my culture. As we saw last time, it may not have anything to do with me personally. It could be that new person I've met reminds me of somebody else, perhaps a person I had great difficulty with, and so I feel insecure. I feel wary because of that. That's reactivity. We need, in this approach, to really get a finer understanding of what it's like to be reactive. You notice this very easily in meditation because you sit still, you focus on the breath, and the next thing you know, all of these repetitive patterns of thought and emotion and memory and longing all kind of automatically fill our minds. And we see that even more crucially in our interactions with people in the world, with world situations. It's more difficult to notice it when we're busy, when we're, let's say, engaged in a meeting or an argument with a spouse or something. And so it's much more difficult to see it. It just becomes a very automatic, very powerful way of reacting that we just get caught up in. So to work with reactivity requires more than just having a theoretical understanding of this particular model of Buddhist practice. It has to do with training oneself through self-awareness, through mindfulness, just by paying closer attention to how you respond and react to situations. And to do to the point where we can begin to spot these reactive patterns sooner than later. We begin to recognize them. We get a taste for what they're like. And in doing so, we're then able to, as it were, catch that warning signal and not get caught up in that anger, in that judgmentality, or whatever it might be. So reactivity really is the past that we hold within our own body, within our own minds, and to some extent within our nervous system. Some of these reactive patterns are the product of our biological evolution. They're things that have perhaps go deeper, far deeper down than our simple human existence. And the problem with reactivity is that no matter what advantages it might have provided our ancestors in the past, or even ourselves in the past, it keeps us stuck in what is familiar and known. It's a freezing of things. The Buddha describes reactivity as a kind of desert. He says it's a place in which nothing grows. It's arid. The word in Pali is kila. It's arid, it's barren. Nothing is able to flourish in a reactive state. It keeps you stuck, and it also keeps you kind of inwardly impoverished, even slightly dead to the world. You're just stuck in that one position. Perhaps that's also why we sometimes speak in political parlance of someone being a reactionary. Reactionary means someone who's usually committed to a particular point of view, maybe a very conservative point of view, the traditional point of view, and whatever happens, that's where you react to it from. And that's why you're sometimes criticized for being reactionary. In contrast to reactivity being the past re-emerging in the present, non-reactivity is the present that is no longer driven or inflected by the past. Non-reactivity is therefore the womb of new beginnings that create another possible future. How is that so? Non-reactivity is that space that we're no doubt familiar with at some level, unfamiliar with at others. But non-reactivity occurs each time we come to rest, when we enter into a quiet, still, clear space of mind. For example, when we practice mindfulness, as soon as we are mindful of something, we're non-reactive, because mindfulness itself is a non-reactive state of mind. And as I think I mentioned in previous talks, the Buddha describes mindfulness as the direct path to nirvana. And non-reactivity is how the Buddha defines nirvana. Nirvana is quite simply defined as the absence of greed, the absence of hatred, the absence of opinionatedness or delusion, confusion, however we translate it. And that non-reactivity is the space within us where something new can begin to emerge. Something new is not going to get created through just repeating what we've done in the past. That'll keep us trapped in the past. Non-reactivity is the gateway, the doorway to a new kind of response, a new kind of world that we can be involved in creating in the future. And we might compare this to being like a womb, a garbha in Sanskrit. And even in the early texts, the Buddha speaks of the cultivation of the virtues as being like the it's like a hen cultivating eggs. In other words, an egg is also a garba, a womb, and it's by nurturing these qualities that are potential within us that these skills and virtues can be brought into being, can emerge in the world, and in doing so, in conjunction with others, help us come together to create a future that's not just a repetition of the past. In other words, non-reactivity is also the source of creativity. Creativity is about imagining another way that we can be in this world, as far as imagining another kind of world itself, whether that be a social system, whether it be another form of politics, another kind of economics, a different relationship to the environment. These are the kinds of worlds that we seek to bring into being, to cultivate from being released from the reactive patterns of the past into a non-reactive space in which something new can emerge. Now, as we've already mentioned, non-reactivity, which is a term that I find very helpful, but it's not a term you're going to find in many other Buddhist contexts, is in fact the same as nirvana. Now, many of us have an idea of nirvana as being something like enlightenment, as being unconditioned, as being outside this everyday world of experience. But that, I think, is a big mistake. Certainly, there are forms of Buddhism that still speak of nirvana in this very elevated way. But as I mentioned before, the Thai bhikkhu Buddhadasa spoke of nirvana as being available for everyone. In his essay, which some of you might have had a chance to read, Nirvana for Everyone, he recognizes nirvana is a condition that's actually integral to what it means to be alive. Buddhadasa says that animals experience nirvana each time they come to rest, each time they're no longer in a state of being primed to do something. They come to rest. Human beings come to rest. Whether you're a Buddhist, whether you meditate, you will have moments in your life at which you are at peace, in which reactivity is not pushing and pulling you in all manner of ways. These moments may not last very long, but over time, we develop a taste for what it's like to be at peace with ourselves, to be at peace with the world. And I mentioned on the first talk also this text where the Buddha speaks of the 21 householders who have found fulfillment in the Tathagata, the true person, become seers of the deathless, and go about their business from the perspective of the deathless. I've included that text in the chat, and I've also given the sutra reference so you can look at it there. So here we find a passage, admittedly a passage that's not widely known, but it's there in the numerical discourses of people who live in the world, actively involved in business, in government, in medicine, in all manner of things, but who do their life from the perspective of the deathless. Non-reactivity, to repeat, is a synonym for nirvana. It's a synonym for the deathless. It's a synonym for the unconditioned. Again, this might sound strange to you if you're not used to this kind of language, but all of this is quite clear if you look carefully at the early texts in the Pali Canon. Deathless, unconditioned, nirvana are actually ways of describing the non-reactive state of mind that is not only available to those who meditate, but it's available to all sentient beings. It's that intrinsic capacity to be at peace, to be still, to be focused, to be aware. And although it might last only for 10 seconds, it's nonetheless a reality for those 10 seconds. So the third task is to see, literally, non-reactivity. The word in Pali is sachikaroti, means to look at with your own eyes, literally, to look at it with your own eyes. And this means, I think, something like to get a feel for something in a very personal way, to see something for yourself, look for yourself, we often say in English. Don't trust me, look for yourself. And so the task or the challenge of this approach is actually to start noticing and feeling within our own body minds those moments, those spaces of non-reactivity. And because non-reactivity are those moments of the absence of reactivity, then we can't really understand non-reactivity without having a much better understanding of what it's like to be under the influence of reactivity. So instead of thinking them as two opposites, don't think of them in binary terms, but think of them as poles along a spectrum. On the one side of the spectrum, you have nirvana or non-reactivity. On the other side of the spectrum, you have reactivity, or if you prefer, samsara. But we don't need to think of them as two completely separate things. In fact, they are not understandable apart from one another. They operate within a spectrum. And I think this way of spectrum thinking is very important in this approach, to get out of the binary habit of always thinking in terms of dualities, of opposites, of this and that, of right and wrong, but to recognize for much of our time on Earth, we're actually in that mid-zone where we're non-reactive, but we're also aware that reactivity is still bubbling away. And remember that mindfulness, which will again point to as being a very central quality in this practice, mindfulness is a non-reactive state of mind that can be fully aware of being reactive. So let's say anger is sort of surging up within us. We can either go along with that and get more angry, or we can step back for a moment and watch ourselves being caught up in this anger. And this shows how a non-reactive mind, mindfulness, is able to be fully present with reactivity itself. It doesn't mean that to be non-reactive, you have to shut down every reactive thought or habit in your mind. You don't. The two can quite happily coexist. And I think for much of the time they do. There's a part of our, as long as we're self-aware to some degree, when we're noticing what's going on within us, noticing what's going on around us with the degree of equanimity, then we're in a non-reactive state. We are actually seeing the world from the perspective of the deathless, from the perspective of the unconditioned. The unconditioned, by the way, you can look that up in the connected discourses of the Buddha, in which there's a sequence on the unconditioned. And the Buddha says very clearly that the unconditioned means not to be conditioned by greed, not to be conditioned by hatred, not to be conditioned by confusion. It's being unconditioned by something. There's no unconditioned with a capital U, some transcendent absolute state, which is sometimes how this word is understood, as is the deathless, as is nirvana. In all three cases, with these very key terms, we need to bring them back into the world. We need to see how they speak to our condition as we experience it here and now. They're not terms of transcendence, or if they are terms of transcendence, that only means that we're able to transcend our hatred, transcend our anger, our attachments, our fears, and so on. So we need, therefore, to cultivate a capacity to see or experience those moments of non-reactivity, to recognize them, recognize non-reactivity. And this we can do in two different ways. On the one hand, in meditation or in any kind of formal contemplation. It may be that you have a yoga practice. At the end of the yoga practice, you sit quietly for 5 minutes and you let yourself settle into a non-reactive awareness. And this is perhaps, I think, something quite important if we are to take this practice seriously, is that we need to dedicate a certain amount of time each day, let's say 20 or 30 minutes, in which we try to settle in a non-reactive space of mind. There's many different kinds of meditations, but most of them, I would say, effectively are about learning to experience life from a non-reactive perspective. So that's one aspect of it, something we can actually use in meditation. And I'll say a little bit about that as I continue as well. But perhaps in some ways, what's more important in terms of how we actually get through each day, how we negotiate our working life and our family life and our political life, is that we need, as it were, to experience that non-reactive perspective in daily life. In the midst of all the hustle and bustle and chaos and conflict that we unavoidably find ourselves in this world, can we somehow retain even a fraction of that non-reactive perspective? And I suspect we all have that ability already. Whatever our tradition, whatever our goals in life, we at some level we know those moments where we've found ourselves in the midst of, let's say, a very busy, noisy Indian street scene, all kinds of stuff going on, and weirdly, we can remain calm and attentive and alert. And that's something we really value as a rule, that we're not, in those moments, we're not caught up and entangled in life itself, but we're able to contemplate it, able to sort of just be with it. And the important point of this practice is not that sometimes we do actually experience this non-reactive space, but when we do experience it, to actually consciously value it, to become aware of it, to notice it, to get the real feel of what it's like in those moments. Where does it register in your body, for example? At what points in your body are you non-reactive? What's it actually like in terms of how you feel inside your own emotions and thoughts in being with those things? And it's up for each of us to somehow pursue this inquiry into a non-reactive awareness in our own way that is specific to our own experience of life. It's not something that can be pointed out to us by a guru or defined in some religious text. In practice, it has to do with our own moment of experience itself. And we find in traditions quite different from anything to do with Buddhism or Eastern religions, we find in the poem of T.S. Eliot, the Four Quartets, he speaks about the still point of the turning world, the still point of the turning world. And in other words, he's also attuned to this experience. For him, it's the experience of the poet or the artist or the musician, people who have a creative life, very often understand or experience that creativity as they're being able to dwell in that still point, but without, as it were, extracting it from the world and the busyness and everything. It's the still point of the turning world. The world continues to go round and round and round, but you're able to remain in the still center of that world. And again, that's a nice thing to say. It's probably very attractive, but it's very hard work. to actually achieve. So seeing non-reactivity or recognizing non-reactivity could be compared to the anchor, like an anchor of a boat. It's the anchor of the path. It's what keeps us grounded. It's what keeps us secured to something that is constant within our experience, or hopefully becomes more and more constant in the course of time. And in that way, we also might speak of it as the depth dimension of the path. The metaphor of the path inevitably implies a beginning and an end, a destination. We start somewhere, then we take this path and we go here and we go there and we go there, and then we get to a destination. And that's a very, very central metaphor in all spiritual traditions, whether it's Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or Jain or Taoist or whatever, Islam, they all talk about the path is an utterly central idea, I think, in all traditions that advocate any kind of spiritual development or growth. Seeing non-reactivity, though, is not so much the path in terms of its linear A to B, B to C process, but it's the depth dimension. It's what intersects. It's the moment at which the timeless intersects with time, which is another phrase taken from T.S. Eliot, the poet. So non-reactivity grounds us. It gives us a sense of depth in our practice that's not something that happens separately from our being in the world, but it's the depth dimension of our being in the world. And as one pursues these kinds of practices, we find over time that we're more and more confident and trusting in the depth dimension that's opened up through our practice of meditation or yoga or simply contemplation, philosophical study, and so on. It's an anchor. It keeps us grounded. And again, I'm running out of time a little bit here. But this brings us into the question of the four paths that we're also paralleling to these tasks. And the third path is the path of vision. And this is the Darshana Marga in Sanskrit. Very, very central idea in the Tibetan tradition, in the North Indian traditions of Buddhism, that we move from a path of formation to a path of unification, to a path of vision, to a path of cultivation. So the vision, the path of vision, and the path of recognizing the stopping of reactivity are the same. And in terms of the virtues to be cultivated in this path of vision, we have what are called the 7 facets of awakening. And you'll see those listed on your chart under the 3rd column. You'll see the path of vision, and then you have these 7 qualities that, as it were, describe as a kind of phenomenology of depth, of awareness of non-reactivity. We find 7 qualities that support that kind of seeing. And I'll just read through them so we can hear them. I don't have time to go into each one in great detail, but many of these qualities will not be unfamiliar to you. And once again, we start with mindfulness. And as I pointed out at the beginning of this series of talks, mindfulness is the only virtue that occurs explicitly in the first task, the second task, the third task, and the fourth task. And to me, this points out how it is the central feature of this practice, this cultivation of mindful awareness, mindful attention. But remembering also that mindfulness has to do with recollection, smriti, in Hindi, in Sanskrit, means also to remember, to be aware of something in the past. Like you go in Delhi, you can go to the Gandhi Smriti, the memorial for Mahatma Gandhi, Smriti, sati, same word. It's not just to be mindful with what's present, but it's also to be mindful of what you value. It's to remember people who have led great lives. It's to erect memorials to such people, like Mahatma Gandhi, for example. Mindfulness here is to remember to be mindful of that non-reactive quality of consciousness. In other words, when our mind starts wandering, let's say in meditation, then at this point in the path, we need to say, remember non-reactivity. Come back to being mindful of what within you now is not reactive. To remember to be non-reactive, remember that there is a still, open, still point of the world deep within you. This is tied to the second quality, which is that of wonder. Wonder, the capacity to no longer be imprisoned in fixed ideas and doctrines and dogmas and beliefs, but to be able, in a non-reactive mind, to simply be open with wonder and awe at what is going on, that anything at all is going on. Again, different traditions compare this to the experience of a young child. To be like a young child, to no longer be burdened by the opinions and the beliefs of your education or your role in some position or some company or something, or some belief system, and just to come back to that simplicity of awareness that you so admire in your children. In other words, the capacity to be open and simply surprised and astonished by the most simple things. And again, I think this is a quality that emerges as soon as the mind starts to quieten down, as soon as you get to be more focused, as soon as you learn to be able to be still. Naturally, the world then begins to appear to you in a new way. It might be that the colors and the sounds become more intense, more radiant in some way. And this, in a way, is tapping into a capacity we have for a kind of mystical appreciation of life itself. But it too is a quality that can be cultivated, can be developed. In Zen Buddhism, a tradition in which I trained for a number of years and still practice very much, very regularly. Wonder boils down to the capacity to ask questions. And the question that I trained with in Zen is the question, what is this? To get the mind, first of all, to become somewhat more still, and in that stillness to quietly ask yourself, what is this? What is going on here? And not to repeat the question as though it is a mantra, but rather just to listen, to allow ourselves to wonder, allow ourselves to recover that primal astonishment that may have greeted the first humans on Earth when they finally found the time just to stop and wonder. And that, I feel, is very, very much at the heart of this practice. It's an openness to experience. It's a willingness to be astonished, to be surprised, and also to let go of our certainties. Wonder implies a kind of uncertainty, a willingness to just take the experience of the world for whatever it might be displaying to us in this moment. But that also requires a certain courage, the third of these facets. This can be challenging. We don't like our certainties to be upset. We might feel it quite scary in some ways to go into these kinds of meditative stillness and wonder and mindfulness, because we're letting go necessarily of our opinions and views and beliefs that may not even be terribly conscious. But sometimes people report that meditation takes them into places where they don't feel safe. It might be that it does release forgotten trauma or other memories that we'd rather keep suppressed. But in many ways, this is the courage, I think, to actually, face life as it is, rather than life as we would prefer it to be or would like it to be. It's a willingness to let go of our reactionary habits. And this can lead us very easily, I feel, into a certain experience of joy. So yes, it can be scary at times. So once you overcome those resistances and settle into that state of mindful wonder, it's also affectively accompanied by a sense of well-being. It's difficult to imagine a being at peace with oneself and not feeling a certain joy, a certain happiness in that. So this too, this sense of joy, this inner joy that is not created or determined by some external input. It's something that arises from deep within ourselves. So that too is part of this capacity we have to experience a non-reactive, non-dogmatic state of mind. And that gives rise to a certain joy. And then finally, we have stillness, collectedness, and equanimity. And these are kind of the stabilizing forces in meditation. Stillness is basically the capacity we have. Again, we're not often trained in our societies to develop these qualities, but the capacity we have to be still, to be tranquil, to be peaceful, to stop, and to just dwell in the moment itself. And without that stillness, we're not really going to be able to tap down into the depths of our experience. We need to be still in order to hear and see and taste and feel in a way that's not upset or destabilized by reactive emotions and thoughts and so forth and so on. It's an inner stillness. Collectedness is my translation of the Sanskrit word samadhi, which again means different things in different Indian traditions. But basically, what it has to do with this, it's the capacity to be focused, to be collected. The word in Pali, at least, literally means to sweep leaves together into a pile, is one of the metaphors used. It's to bring our energies together rather than have them just, separated, going off in different directions. It's to collect our energies. A bit like in the previous talk, we spoke of harmonizing and unifying ourselves on the path of unification, this prayoga marga. Here it appears again, this quality of being able to be coherent and integrated within ourselves. And finally, this leads to a quality of equanimity. Equanimity being a kind of balance. Equanimity sometimes explained as being neither attracted to something nor being averse or reacting against something. Equanimity is that quality we have that can notice where we're being pulled, where we're being pushed, where we're being triggered, where we're being seduced, perhaps, in some occasions. And equanimity is that calm, balanced state that recognizes all of these fears and attractions, but doesn't get sucked into them, allows them to be, watches them come, watches them go, but never loses its groundedness in its own primary sense of balance. So the path of vision, if we can imagine being able to unify mindfulness, wonder, courage, joy, stillness, collectedness, and equanimity. We can imagine what it's like to really see, and not just see, but really feel the non-reactive depth experience that is the kind of anchor of this path. So that's all that I want to cover today. Quickly, I'll just go over what we have gone through so far. We started looking at the logic of awakening, how awakening is not a state, but it's an ongoing process of being fully alive, how these tasks and these paths, one leads to the next, to the next, to the next. It embodies the principle of conditionality. In other words, the actual way the world works. It's not something transcendent. And how reactivity, in being a victim of reactivity, we're basically holding on to the security of the past, and we're letting that intervene in our experience of the present. Whereas non-reactivity is a present moment, uninflected by the reactive patterns of the past. And as such, it is the womb for a new beginning that can create another future. It's a source of creativity. And non-reactivity is, as we've just been saying, something we can experience in meditation, something that we can begin to become more attuned to in our daily life. We might call it the still point of the turning world, and it becomes the depth dimension or the anchor of the path. And if we flesh this idea of seeing non-reactivity out into more detail, we find that it's refracted through mindfulness and wonder and courage, joy, stillness, collectedness, and equanimity. So there's quite a lot of information there. I don't know how it's landed with any of you, so I'm going to now open up the session. We have just over half an hour in which we can explore this further. So whoever wants to ask a question or make a comment, just either put up your electronic hand or just start speaking. It's up to you really, but remember to switch on your mic.
Stephen,
Mangesh.
yeah, Stephenji, I think the talk today is about a very key central idea in Buddhism as to how we can stop being reactive. And there are many views about nirvana which go into abstract, sometimes kind of what we can say a view of mysticism. But your presentation of the very key concept in Buddhism, like nirvana is very down to earth and very earthly in a sense,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
isn't it? And it does away with all these mystical or mysterious elements about the nirvana, and I find it very approachable and very practical. Uh, but I think if you can elaborate a little bit on the various conceptions of this particular uh, term or the path vis-a-vis how it creates confusion in the history of Buddhism as to what is nirvana, what constitutes nirvana, because you brought so many things together. But I think you understand what I'm trying to say. So just a little bit flavor of.
Okay. I'm fully aware that when I start speaking of nirvana as though it's something available to everybody in each moment, that can give rise to a certain disbelief. And I remember once listening to a podcast with a very famous Buddhist monk. I won't give the name. And the interviewer, somewhat naively perhaps, he said, and Venerable Sir, have you ever experienced nirvana? And the monk just broke down laughing. He thought this was the most absurd, strange question that anybody could ask. That this, of course, implying that, nirvana is something out of our reach. And nirvana is something that you might attain after a few lifetimes of practice. Nirvana is something that perhaps great mystics and so on have some insight into. But it's certainly not the sort of thing that you or I, ordinary people, can have much to do with. And the Buddhist tradition, in all of its schools, has actually, in a sense, reinforced that perception. It's very widespread. It's rather striking in a way. But you see, I think this is what happens with religion. When a philosophy, and I would argue that Buddhism is started out life probably as a practical philosophy, somewhat similar to Stoicism, perhaps, but it mutated quite quickly, I think, into an Indian religion. And when something becomes a religion and you then get a priesthood, a body of experts who explain to you what it means, who define it, who write scholarly texts on it, you also then achieve a hierarchy of power. You get the experts and you get the lay people. And in Buddhism, you get the bhikkhus, the bhikkhu sangha, and you get the laity. And as soon as you make that kind of distinction, you're basically setting yourself up for an ever-increasing distance between the highest goals of the tradition, let's say nirvana, and the ordinary world of samsara. And the more that gap opens up, the more out of reach does nirvana become, or the more out of reach does God become, if you're in a theistic religion. Now, this is not my idea. This is based, what I'm saying now is based very much on the work of a 19th century German theologian philosopher called Ludwig Feuerbach, who wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity in 1841, I think. And there he described exactly this process of what he calls alienation, that religion is in the business of alienation. It wants to alienate the ordinary man or woman on the street from their essential nature of being wise, of being powerful, and of being loving. And it creates a system whereby those values are over time projected more and more on the spiritual elite, in other words, the senior monks and nuns, if you still have nuns, and they're the ones who embody wisdom and compassion and power. You increasingly become unwise, uncompassionate, and powerless. And it's that notion of religion as a system of alienation that was then picked up by Karl Marx. Marx and Engels followed Feuerbach in their understanding of religion. And the idea of religion is the opium of the people. It didn't come from Karl Marx, it came from Ludwig Feuerbach. That's where the idea begins. Now, I found this idea very helpful because although Feuerbach doesn't have anything to say about Buddhism, or very little, he didn't know about it then because it wasn't understood at all in the West. Nonetheless, his critique of religion as a way of alienating people is just as true, in my experience, of Buddhist organizations as of Christianity and other religions. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to take Feuerbach's idea and then apply it to the Buddhist situation, historical situation, and try to get back to the beginning, try to recover this idea of Nibbana, which, again, if you look at it in these texts I've been sharing with you, these 21 householders who go about their business from the perspective of the deathless, of Nirvana, of the unconditioned, that points very clearly to how Nirvana is not some transcendent mystical experience, but it's something that can coexist with your work as a business person. But these sorts of passages are kind of ignored. They're forgotten. They're not broadcast. And the same when the Buddha defines nirvana as just the absence of greed, hatred, delusion. I can give other passages too. If you look in my books, you'll see any number of texts that support this kind of position. So what I'm trying to do is recover that early position, which I think has the strength of making the Dharma more egalitarian. Remember that the Buddha's idea of the early community was that monks and nuns and laymen and laywomen would all have the same responsibilities. It's not as though the monks and the nuns are the teachers and the lay people are the students. That's what it is like in most Buddhist societies today. The Buddha described every member of his parisa, of his assembly, as having the same responsibilities to study, to practice, to learn, and to teach. That's all four. So I think our challenge today, for many of us in the secular world, is to try to recover a more secular vision of the Dharma that is not premised upon the division between monks and lay people. It's not conditioned by the split between relative truth and absolute truth, which is again something the Buddha never spoke of, not once. And yet it's become a standard doctrine within all schools of Buddhism. You've got the absolute truth, and then you've got these relative truths. And we're stuck in this world of relative truth, and we can only yearn for this absolute truth. But that very way of dividing reality into two and separating off the absolute for the experts and the relative for the ordinary people is basically falling into that trap of religion becoming a kind of progressive form of alienation. I could go on, but I noticed there are two other questions, and yes, Mangesh, quick.
Just a quick comment before. Baba Sahib Ambedkar equates Nibbana itself with the Noble Eightfold Path. He says that he equates Nibbana or Nirvana with the Noble Eightfold Path. He says that Nibbana is Noble Eightfold Path. So I just wanted to, comment, making it more like grounded here and now than, thinking it in terms of the mystical sort of terms.
I wouldn't equate nirvana with the Noble Eightfold Path, but I would argue, and perhaps this is what Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar meant, is that nirvana, the experience of non-reactivity, is where the Noble Eightfold Path begins. You see, traditionally, Buddhism describes the Noble Eightfold Path as the Noble Eightfold Path that leads to the end of suffering, in other words, to nirvana in that final, ultimate sense. But if you look at the logic of awakening, and we're describing it here, we see that the experience of nirvana is precisely that which allows the Eightfold Path to come about. That the Eightfold Path begins from a non-reactive space. The Eightfold Path is the kind of life you would lead if you were living your life from the perspective of nirvana. And if Dr. Ambedkar connects the Eightfold Path to nirvana in that way, then I would be completely on board with that. Satish Shambhakar, do you have a question or a comment? Please put on your camera so we can see you.
Yes. Yes, Stephen. I'm sorry I can't put on my camera because there is so much hot here, so I'm not clad well. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah.
It's very hot here, so that's why I can't put on my camera because I'm scantily clad.
Okay. No, that makes sense. That's fine.
Yeah, yeah. You talked about Mahatma Gandhi, M.K. Gandhi, about his mindfulness, about his personality. Do you mean to say that Mahatma Gandhi was a person of mindfulness, or what? And
no. I wasn't trying to say that at all. I'm just pointing out that the word mindfulness, sati, is the Pali version of the Sanskrit word smrti. Okay, now smrti is used not just for being mindful, but smrti means to remember. And that meaning is also there in the word sati in Pali as well. Mindfulness is not just about being present. That's how mindfulness, as it's often understood in the West today, is basically about being more attentive, noticing things better. And that's certainly very much part of it. But it's also true that mindfulness has to do with recollecting or remembering what matters for you, what your values are. When I first came across the teachings of mindfulness, I didn't do that. It wasn't from the Theravada or the early Buddhist tradition, but it was from Shantideva, who was an 8th century Indian Mahayana poet, monk, philosopher, who has a chapter on sati, on smriti, in his book, The Bodhisattvacharya Avatara, the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, in which he understands mindfulness not just as being attentive and aware of your mental states, although that's very clearly part of what he's saying as well, but what for him is important to be mindful of is to be mindful of your values, to be mindful of what it is that your life is for, to be mindful of what matters for you. So we find that usage in India today. When we go to the Gandhi Smriti, we're going to somewhere where we can be mindful of Mahatma Gandhi. I'm not suggesting that Mahatma Gandhi was practicing mindfulness. He probably was, but that's not the point I was making. I was just using it as an example to show how mindfulness also includes recollecting value. And in fact, I'll come back onto that very point at the beginning of next week's presentation as well. Does that answer your question, or did I get hold of the wrong end of the stick?
Yes, thanks for clarifying that you because I understood that you talked about M.K. Gandhi as a person of mindfulness who was practicing kind of a mindfulness or an image of mindfulness. So I think you made your point clear that that's not the point, that you gave the example of Mahatma Gandhi, M.K. Gandhi as a person of mindfulness. Is that so?
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Another
Okay.
question, may I ask? Another question. Just one last question.
Yes.
May I ask?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah. In today's world, we have to do a lot of multitasking.
So I
Different
didn't hear
work,
that last. I didn't hear that.
multitasking. We have to do a lot of multitasking.
Oh, multitasking. Yeah.
Multitasking, yeah. Uh, During the job and the family and the all, there are so many works, and we have to do a lot of multitasking. So, in today's such kind of a world, where we have to do different things at the same time, then how we can practice mindfulness?
That's a very good question, actually. I would say yes. I don't think that's a problem at all, but it's very challenging. You see, I think let's say in the 5th century BC, when the Buddha lived, there probably wasn't a great deal of multitasking going on. Probably more than we would think, especially in people working in business and government and so on. And they would have been very busy people. I think they've always been busy people. In other words, there've always been the need to multitask. But I think in our current world, it's really been increased to a degree that is actually quite extraordinary, and I think very challenging, because we easily get completely overwhelmed and absorbed into these demands on our time and our life, that we've got to attend to our kids, we've got to attend to our work situation, and then we've got to deal with something that's going on, let's say, in our local political organization, or we have stuff to do in a different company we're also allied with, and the phone is ringing and we're getting all these messages. I mean, this is the nature of our modern life, and it seems to overwhelm mindfulness in some ways, or at least mindfulness has to really struggle sometimes to not get, sort of buried beneath all of these demands that are upon us. And so that, I think, points to how we may require, a somewhat more strenuous practice of mindfulness to be able to stabilize ourselves in such a way that the multitasking might still become, still be challenging, but at least we've found a space whereby we're not completely overwhelmed by it. But it also might give rise to the thought, well, maybe I don't have to live like this. Maybe I can simplify my life. It's not just about sorting out my own mind, but mindfulness also gives us the distance to begin to evaluate what I was saying to the previous speaker, the question, what matters most for me? Do I really have to be doing all this stuff? Maybe you do. Maybe there's no way around it, in which case you have to learn to live with it. And you have to bring the mindfulness into the situation. But it could also be that you've taken on a lot of responsibilities for all kinds of motives, so that, you can be more successful or perhaps impress people, or you feel a strong sense of duty or responsibility that you feel obliged to fulfill. But it could be that a lot of the reasons that you get drawn into a situation of multitasking is because you've made certain choices that you didn't necessarily have to make. So this calls, I think, not that, everyone should become a monk or anything, but it does, I think, challenge us to ask how we might lead our lives more simply, with a greater sanity, and be willing to let go of things. I think one of the great illusions that the modern person suffers from, particularly if you're a successful professional in some work, is this idea of being indispensable. I remember feeling this way, that, if I left this organization, it would fall apart, that kind of thinking. Or I have to do this because if I don't do it, nobody will. There's all kinds of rationalizations. And perhaps we build a role for ourselves, in, let's say, in the workplace, where we're taking on too much responsibility. It's like these politicians who run about 6 ministries. I don't know about that, but actually saying that, this will be my last point. One of the great figures in the history of the mindfulness tradition coming into the modern world is a man called U Ba Khin, a Burmese teacher, who was the teacher of Satya Narayan Goenka, who I'm sure you've all heard of. Now, U Ba Khin was not a monk. He was a layperson, and he was not just an ordinary guy. He was the Minister of Finance, I think, in the first post-independence government in Burma, Myanmar. So, and yet he also taught Vipassana. He would have his workers do Vipassana, for an hour a day in his office, in their offices. So this is a man who clearly had an enormous amount of pressure on his life, certainly far more than I could imagine. And yet he was not only practicing Vipassana, he was teaching it. So I think figures like that give us an example of how we can probably, do more in regards our practice of mindfulness than we might think. We might say, I don't have the time to meditate today. But really, we can't find 30 minutes? I'm sure we can if we maybe simplified or reorganized ourselves, or simply made a different set of priorities of what really matters most to us. I think the key question is to really make it as clear as we can to ourselves, where do our priorities lie? And I think if we could settle that kind of question, a lot of these other questions would fall into place. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
So Prashant, you're next.
Yeah, Stephen, am I audible?
Very audible, yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us that renewed understanding of nirvana. To continue with what our brother Mangesh said, this is not question actually. This is a comment. I remember recently. Hello.
Hello, I'm here.
Hello.
Hello. Have we lost you, Prashant? I think we might have lost Prashant. Are you there?
Am I audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, so recently I was having this discussion with my friends, and we were discussing about, why should we walk this path of mindfulness?
Mm-hmm.
And while answering to that, my friends, they said that, oh, if we walk long enough on this path, mindfulness, you will be able to achieve nirvana.
Uh-huh.
And then I said, like, okay, what do you understand by nirvana? And they said that will be able to break the cycle of this birth.
Mm-hmm.
Being a student of economics myself,
Mm-hmm.
I remember what Lord Keynes said a few decades back, that in the long run we are all dead. And I didn't find that that breaking of that birth cycle fascinating enough, and
Uh-huh.
tempting enough for me to walk on the path of Dhamma. But
Uh-huh.
what you said today, that nirvana is very much attainable, and is absence of those greed and hatred, those qualities. And also, then while answering to Mangesh Dada, you also use this word egalitarian.
Yeah.
I mean, this is very, very wonderful, very, very wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Prashant. But that's basically yes, you summarized very well, the gist of what I'm trying to get at. And again, your friends who say that if you attain nirvana, then you've broken the cycle of birth and death. Now, that is the standard, that is the traditional Buddhist view. So, one has to respect that. But the point is, it operates within a worldview of ancient Indian cosmology that may not really be so relevant to many of us today. I was trained as a Buddhist monk to think very much along those lines. And the ultimate goal of any practice, whether it's mindfulness or compassion, is to break free of the cycle of birth and death, and that to achieve the nirvana, which is the ending of rebirth, basically. But I don't understand it that way anymore. I can't really. That language doesn't speak to me anymore. I'm not saying it's wrong or anything. It's just that it no longer addresses the condition of life of myself and my friends and my peers and many, many people living in a secular world today. And so when I go back into those early texts and try to unpack what the Buddha might have meant, I suddenly find there's another way of looking at things that's just as much in those texts as the ending of birth and death story. But how I would understand it is that
Yes.
instead of the ending of birth and death, it's the ending of reactivity that matters. And that's actually how the Buddha defines it, that the birth and death is compulsive repetition, really, which I spoke of last week. Reactivity is compulsive repetition. So to break free of those cycles has as much to do with breaking free of inherited habits of mind, reactive patterns that we have been brought up with, that we've known as in our own psychology, that we know it from our families, our cultures, and is to break free of the limiting nature of that particular way of behavior. So to break free, to find freedom, is to find freedom from reactivity, not from birth and death. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go straight on
Yeah.
to Mayo, who's got his hand up. Mayo,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
it's a pleasure.
Yes,
Mayo.
yes. Hi, Stephen. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible, but speak up a little bit.
Okay. Actually, I would like to give a very short answer on how to stop a reactivity. Just in case if I'm wrong, please correct me. I think we can stop the reactivity by being more compassionate towards ourselves, also to others. And when we are dealing towards ourselves and to others with delusion, hatred, and greed, then reactivity continues. And when we are more compassionate toward ourselves also and others, then reactivity stops. Is that true? Is that correct?
Yes, I think that is a very good way to put it. Because you see, if you think of greed, hatred, delusion, those are considered to be the three roots of evil is a term sometimes used. 3 roots of negativity, let's say. And the Buddha also speaks of 3 roots of virtue, which are literally the opposite. It's adosa, alobha, amoha, non-greed, non-hatred, non-reactivity. Now, this is a way of speaking that we find in many Indian philosophical texts, and it's tempting to think that it just means the absence of greed, the absence of hatred. So dosa is hatred. Adosa, therefore, is non-hatred. But in fact, that's not really what it means. What it means is something like the opposite of. So the opposite of hatred is compassion and love and tolerance. The opposite of greed is generosity. The opposite of confusion is wisdom. So when we talk of non-reactivity, we're not talking just of the absence of these things, but we're also talking about the counter values of these things. So as you say, if you act compassionately to others, you're actually also acting non-reactively. You're not reacting to the other in the sense of what you like, what you dislike. You're actually reaching out to the suffering of the other. You're treating the other person as a suffering being who needs attention and care. And you're not caught up in your fear and your dislike and your likes and your wants and so on. In a moment of compassion or in a moment of love or in a moment of equanimity or any of these virtues, that moment is already one of non-reactivity. But we have to remember also, of course, that we might, be very compassionate people. We spend a lot of time working with others suffering, but that doesn't mean that when we find ourselves in another situation, we're not once again the victims of our likes and our fears and our wants and our desires. And I'm glad you brought this up, and I think we'll go back to this point again next week, is that non-reactivity is also the practice of those qualities or those virtues that are in themselves not reactive. Mindfulness, I gave as my example. You have now given the example of compassion. That all of
I think
these kinds.
one thing I would like to add is
Yes,
compassion with wisdom. Compassion with wisdom would be the great thing to stop
that
the
would
reaction.
no, I agree with you. And again, I think it touches on what we've been saying here, is that if you look at the chart that I've shared with you, you'll find that the Buddha is very reluctant just to single out compassion or wisdom or mindfulness as single events. He always clusters them together with other qualities. So in other words, it's not a question of just being compassionate, nor is it a question of just being mindful. It's a question of learning how to integrate these different values into the complex situations we find ourselves facing in life. And so, as you correctly say, you could have a compassion that's completely unwise, that's completely unmindful, perhaps too. It's just a kind of just a deep sense of pity and concern for another person. But if you don't have the tools of how to respond effectively to that person's suffering, for example, you meet a beggar on the street. Yeah, one thing you could do is to give them some money, and that's probably a good thing. But on the other hand, if you just live from compassion, you could give all of your money away, every last rupee you have in the bank, and you'll end up poor, and the world will not be much better. We need a compassion that's also wise, and that we might, for example, then understand as a motive for getting involved in social change, in political action. That might be the wiser way of being compassionate rather than just giving all your money away. So absolutely, I mean, that's just one example. But I think we need to think of these virtues and these skills that we're discussing not as standalone good things, that all we have to do is mindfulness, or all we have to do is love, but actually to see that how they actually have to work together that they are team players, as one of my friends put it. And that's, I think, what the Buddha's vision is trying to communicate, that I've tried to illustrate on the cartography of care, care being the overriding virtue, but all of the other virtues contribute to it and need to work together in order to be truly effective. So thank you very much, Maya. And I'm afraid we have to stop
Thank you,
here.
Stefan.
It's
Stefan, one question I have. You can take that question in another next class also.
in the next class, I'll take your next question. I promise. You'll be the first one next week.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for being here. You can listen to this again if you wish. It's been recorded. And I look forward to seeing you in 7 days' time on next Sunday. And that'll be our final session. So keep well.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you so much, and see you next week.
Okay.
Thank
See
you.
you.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye.
Bye. Bye.